Okay, today's workshop quick takes will be just a brief one. What we're looking at today is some basic woodworking, and in particular restoration of some damaged toys I've got here. Now, if you've got children or if you have worked with children, then you know that these wood train sets are made by a few different companies. I think Melissa and Doug has their version, and I don't even know where some of these came from. But they're really nice, and they give your child a lot of creativity to play around with stuff and invent their own little city or train system or whatever. And the only downside to them is if they get left outdoors for any reason, they're going to get damaged. And that's exactly what happened to these. Some time ago I got a hold of a small box of these from, actually it was a library that was getting rid of them. They'd had to cycle out some toys, and these had been left outside, some of them had anyway, and had gotten damaged by water. You leave something outdoors, it's going to get rained on now and then, and it will damage the wood. The other thing they'd done is they had set up a semi-permanent train table and had glued down some of these, and so that left behind this nasty glue residue with stuff like that. And you know, I wanted to add these to our children's train set, but first I had to make sure they weren't going to get splinters off of them or just have pieces plain break away, because this wood is definitely feeling a little bit rough. So what do you do about that? Well, the first and obvious thing, of course, is you're going to have to sand. Now, for something like this, I might have to do a little bit harder sanding or maybe even pre-chisel. So that's what we do here. And you gotta be careful because, again, this wood has been dried out. You can actually split off whole chunks of it. And on some of these, that's happened anyway. This one here has had a whole big piece come out of it, but fortunately, it's not enough to derail the train. It'll still work if you assemble it and run with it, so I'm going to try and reuse it. This one here, however, again, you know, that big piece of glue, we can't have that, so I got to try and split it off as best I can, and hopefully it just fractures neatly, and it looks like it will. So I can get off most of it, but then I got to figure out what to do with this big ugly piece here. And as far as I can tell, the only way to really do that is going to be heavy sanding. And so you got to do this for a while, and I'll finish it over the trash can. That's looking a little better. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to use a mesh drywall sander. I just happen to have this around with a lot of spare sheets from some past work, but it came right off. So that's good enough. But then what I got to do to finish off the piece is I got to sand both sides, and this time I'm using a sanding sponge. The sanding sponge is nice because I can work around all these little ridges and grooves and make sure I don't have any sharp edges or splinters left over. And yeah, I'm feeling some edges right there that I do want to get rid of, because the wood, as it's dried out, it's splintered just a little bit on the edges, and eventually someone's going to get that stuck in their fingers. Okay, so after a few minutes of sanding, there we are. It's not perfect, but it feels generally smooth all the way around. And now what I need to do is consider how I'm going to finish it, because I've taken the sharp edges off, but the surface of the wood is still a little bit dry. Oops, still got one more in there, and I'm going to switch to there we go. Okay, so I've cleaned up the piece of wood. The question is, what do I do with it now? The wood's still a little bit dry. It's still possible that it could fragment and splinter. So I need to seal the outside somehow so that doesn't happen. Normally for woodworking projects, I like to use polyurethane, or you could think of something like maybe tung oil or things like that, but there's a problem. This is a children's toy. So if I start using petrochemical-based sealers or finishes, what kind of residue is it going to leave in there? And in particular, if a young child starts chewing on this or whatever, what are they going to get exposed to? So my solution to try and reduce the risk is polyacrylic. This is a water-based protective finish, and it's basically leaves behind an acrylic plastic, and it's not something you want to be eating on a regular basis. As far as I know, getting a few chips of this into your system is way less problematic than eating some sort of petrochemical-based finish. The other thing I thought of, and I haven't really tried, is this is a food-safe wood oil. Now, these kinds of things are sold for refinishing cutting boards. Cutting boards, of course, get exposed to water on a regular basis, and if you've got like a nice little compressed wood cutting board, or even just a maple block, or whatever you like to use, it's going to dry out and end up a lot like this, and worse in time, unless you refinish it. And so this is often used to refinish them. It's food safe. It's not something you want to sit there and chug. No. But what it is it's a mineral oil. It doesn't go rancid like, say, olive oil or some other food oil that you might try to use. And it's not supposed to be terribly harmful if a tiny bit gets on your food. It'll just go through your system. And if you do drink a little bit more of it, I suspect it would act a lot like a laxative.
Why? Why?
I'm going to go ahead and stick with the polyacrylic. So, one interesting thing about these water-based finishes, if you've used them before, is you'll notice that when they are in suspended solution, they're very milky looking. And they kind of foam up a bit as well. So you got to be careful how thick you apply them, because you don't want to have like a giant chunk of like foamy residue left someplace, because then it'll dry and kind of leave like a thick clear section that can then crack back off again, because again, it's a fragile plastic, it's acrylic. But what I will do is I save old socks for exactly this purpose, or a foam brush is useful. Just rub a thin coating on. And you will notice how that is actually going into the wood and sealing the outer surface. The other nice thing about using the polyacrylic versus, say, polyurethane or some other oil-based type of finish is that it dries very quickly. So, I don't know, maybe in an hour or so, this will be completely done and ready to go if I want, although sometimes I'll even sit around longer to just do a batch of these things, because I've still probably got another 10 or 15 pieces to finish, and I've already done 20 or 30 so far. It was a decent sized set that I got a hold of. But yeah, notice the boundary line there between where I've applied the finish and where it's still going on. So for this small piece, the sock is working fine. Now, if you had a larger piece, like when I did this one earlier, I used the brush quite a bit on this one because it helped me get inside and out of all this area. The other thing the brush can be nice for when you're working with a piece like this that has interlocking sections is the foam brush is way better at getting inside an area like this. And sometimes it can even be helpful with like these little track rail areas, things like that. So, you know, you got options. Whatever works for you. I do like to save old socks in particular when I am working with polyurethane though, because you get one of these saturated, it's nice and wide, and then you just do long, gentle strokes and you can get a really nice clean finish, provided you've thinned your polyurethane correctly. But okay, there it is. That's one piece done. And what'll happen next is I'll let it sit to dry. It's actually not that wet at all. I'm not going for a really thick glossy finish. I just want to kind of get it into the surface of the wood and then be done. But to show you what happens next is when they're dry and done, they start looking a lot like this. And that's great. I think I have just enough on this one. It's not really, you know, popping up out to try and make some sort of semi-gloss finish, but it is soaked into the wood. It has nicely sealed the surface and the grain. It feels smooth, but it also doesn't have any like heavy plastic finish that's going to chip off. And that's exactly what I want. And then, to make sure it's ready for child use, you know, it still has a little bit of a rough feel to it. This is one I did earlier. It's been drying for a couple hours, so it's fine. Is just take the sanding sponge and very lightly, again a fine grit, very lightly, go over the surface, hit the corners, and there it is. Nice and smooth, doesn't catch my glove at all. Kid can play with this. They're not going to pick up any slivers unless they're really, really trying somehow. They can chew on it. It's not going to cut into their lip. And because I used a reasonably non-toxic finish, once it's dried and cured, there's really nothing in here that's going to make them sick if they try to chew on it or build up in their system. And yeah, here's another piece I did earlier. This is a much larger one, obviously, but again, if I hold it in the light just right, you can see there's just a touch of a sheen on it. But yeah, I like it. It's a nice way to restore an otherwise fairly expensive toy for some pieces that would otherwise have to be thrown out because they were in a state where they weren't really good for children to be playing with, and now it's fine again. So, handy little tip to think about if you've got some wood toys, especially stuff like this that's expensive and hard to replace without spending a pile of money. And it just needs a little TLC and it's ready to go again.
Has anyone seen my phone?